Hey guys, welcome back to Results Junkies podcast. A lot of stuff going on today. A very small change in the Apple world is causing a bit of a ripple in the social media community. More alerts about large media organizations suing generative AI companies for using their content. And we now have details on how Google is going to be required to enforce the recent ruling in terms of opening up Android to other app stores. Mr. Singh, lots of big things moving and shaking right now.
Never a dull moment, man. I think I told you in the pre-show, I feel like I've been getting my teeth kicked in over the last couple of days between industry conference, hurricanes coming through, affecting some of our employees, and all the mess that comes with being investor-backed now.
Yeah.
So it's been a little wild, but yeah, no shortage of news going out. And I think some of this stuff I think is particularly interesting because even though it may not seem directly impactful to businesses like yours or mine or, the listeners, I think they're worth keeping. We'll touch more on where I should have asked you in the pre-show. So where are you sitting right now?
I am at the Aria in Las Vegas. Be here for another day and then headed to New York before finally heading home. And then another whirlwind week next week, quick trip to Minnesota, and then go home, and then coming to visit you in South Dakota.
I love it. That's only like 10 days away. It's going to be fun.
And apparently we're flying on the same flights to South Dakota, shockingly.
Did not know that. Now I do. But that means I get to mooch into your club access. So that'll be great.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a bold move to want to spend time in the United Clubs. God bless you. Maybe we'll go hang out in the Capital One Lounge. That might be better.
I'm going wherever you go, so I'm down.
Yeah, just for clarity though, when we board the plane on the remote chance that I get upgraded, just wave at me as you walk by and just keep going.
I love it. I will.
Don't make it awkward.
I will. I will absolutely make it awkward. It'll be great. Yeah.
All right, well, quick housekeeping. Show at resultsjunkies.com is how you find us. He is at Paul Singh on all the social media channels. I am at Pizza in Motion. We got a few topics on the list today. I'd forgotten we also had some user feedback. We'll lump that in for next week. I'd forgotten about that, so we'll tee that up for next week since we didn't discuss that in pre-show. But I think the place to start is on this Apple change because it's a very nuanced change, but causing something of an uproar in the social media space. And so the basics of the change, sort of, Apple moving a little bit further into privacy controls and giving users more options. They've made a change now. So for folks who are listening or watching, typically when you have a social media app, and basically any app that it's not just social media apps, any apps that want access to your contacts, the default question from Apple was, do you want this app to have access to your contents or not? And it was a yes/no question. The question is now a bit more nuanced, and so it's no, you don't want to have access to the comments, but the yes option has changed. The yes option is either yes, you can have access to my contacts, or yes, but not all of my contacts. It's not a binary choice anymore. You can select as few as one and as many as you want of your contacts, but you can select them individually or deselect them. Paul, curious to hear your thoughts on this change.
I think that this is one of those changes that seems super subtle at face value, but will likely have compounding effects that are probably as large as the iOS 14, if I remember right, the iOS 14 ask app to track situation. So let me kind of back up here. Let's first admit your business, my business, and I would say the vast majority of businesses that are listening to this podcast probably are not interacting directly with the contact list for, our respective businesses. But to your point, whether you use TikTok personally or Facebook or LinkedIn or pick anything, one of the oldest tricks in the book in terms of, network creation for these apps is to get access to that contact list.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of build demographics and build algorithms around that, and you see this as a user when it says things like, hey, here's a friend you might know, right? It's somebody that had a phone number, that sort of thing, right? So let's talk about why this is important. I'll just use Strata as an example. We don't have an app. We don't ask for access to your contact list. That is not in our core business. And you would think at face value, I don't care about this change. However, the top of funnel for us in terms of distribution of our content and our pay-per-click strategy is built around lookalike audiences and things like that. Like it's the algorithms of Facebook and Google and Instagram and all these things, right? And so this particular change curtails the ability of those platforms to create those lookalike audiences for us.
Mhm.
And so indirectly, the impact I think we're going to see over the next year or so as this gets rolled out is that it probably is going to become a little bit more difficult to target, our audience. And again, without rambling, I'll just kind of tie this back to, I think that this subtle change will likely have the ripple effects of the Ask App Not to Track of 5 years ago, which is crazy. That's like 4 or 5 years ago already.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to change the way we all think about pay per click and targeting. I would think cost per click, CPAs, everything are probably going to get a little bit higher. And, we'll see how it goes. So it's probably good for consumers and probably going to make life a lot harder for internet marketers. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things. First, obviously, yeah, I do think it's good for consumers, and I'll loop back on that in a second. I think, there's a couple of things. First off, if for any new social media apps, I think this is obviously more impactful because they've never pulled down an address book. My guess, and this is just a guess, is that if you have a Facebook or an Instagram account or any of the other existing social media sites, the impacts to those companies will be much more minimal in two different ways. First off is, as outset, today you've already given permission for Facebook or Instagram or whoever to have access to your address book if you've made that choice. And so until you install that app again on your phone, which is usually when somebody gets a new phone or if there's maybe a major iOS upgrade, but something that's going to have some legs on it from a timing standpoint, Facebook, Instagram, those big guys, they're not going to see a big change in those contact files. The other thing I would say is, my guess is, well, Apple has made this change. If you previously gave Facebook access to your address book, and let's say, for example, I gave them access to you, Paul Singh, in my address book, they still have that information. They're not being required to delete that going forward. So in reality, the only bite at the apple I think they'll have with existing users on existing platforms is the access to new contacts.
Do we know that for sure, though? Because
we don't, but everything I've read so far about this talks about what Apple's going to share. It doesn't say that the Facebook or Instagram have a requirement to delete the data they already have.
See, that little devil in the details is going to be the real kicker when this thing comes out. And look, you and I are just pawns in this little cogs or whatever, right? But that right there is going to determine whether or not, or what actually happens or how fast the impact will be. If I remember right with the Ask Not to Track, is that they forced the apps to push that prompt on the next update.
Yep.
So, in that particular scenario, that there is a precedent where they just said, hey, we don't care what you used to be able to do with us. Like, if you want to push an update to the App Store, the next update will have to get this question answered. So if we're talking about precedent here, it would not be out of order, out of line for them to say, hey, Facebook, if you want to push version XYZ out after this releases, you have to force this prompt, and based on the user's answer, clear out anything you have. I mean, I don't think
Apple has any teeth in their agreement to force a third-party company to delete information the customer has already authorized. That's the thing. Like if I've already authorized it,
I think, and for anybody listening to this, if you like play an attorney on the internet or whatever, like hit us up, show it Results Junkies, and tell us this, because my loose interpretation of that part of the existing terms of service is that when you grant access to the contact list, you have access to it, but you're not allowed to copy it to your local servers permanently. So
I disagree. I disagree with that. I've seen evidence that information is, and here's why. It's the downstream thing. I'll use video games as an example. I've played 1 or 2 games on my phone over the years that have some sort of a Facebook connection, and there are contacts in my Facebook list that are no longer in my phone, because when I had a problem with my phone back when we switched from Rackspace, our Exchange server, over to Google. Yep. And I lost a huge chunk of contacts. And there are people who I know I haven't put back on my phone who Facebook says are still contacts, and they're not. The only reason they exist was because they came over from my phone to Facebook, because I'm not really active on Facebook.
this will be interesting to see how this plays out in the long term, because you
Mhm.
and I don't have access to the underlying databases, but
Sure.
your experience is not unique. I mean, I've seen that too, right? But my understanding of how some of those tables work, at least in some of our other portfolio companies, is that when you synchronize, when you hit that button and you say like, yeah, you can have access to the contacts, the way that a lot of them do it is they'll actually then scan through the contact list, try to find other users on the existing platform
Right.
that have similar contact details, and then they link the two accounts with a new user ID connection in their third-party database.
Right.
And then they will systematically then go comb the contact list on weekly or monthly basis looking for new contacts. So my point is, if they were hard coded to your contact list, then when you deleted that contact, in theory, it should have synchronized right away. In fact, what probably happened is that they scanned your contact list, found other users with similar phone numbers, and then or email addresses, whatever you put in there, and then behind the scenes linked those two accounts with your unique. Anyway, I'm getting a little nerdy here, but I think the point still stands that like Apple kind of can do whatever they want. Like historically, I feel like they've never really been scared of it. And again, you and I don't probably get affected by this day to day as individual users, but if you're spending money on ads or whatever else, you'll feel it downstream.
Well, they can do whatever they want to a point, but the reality is that you have a relationship with Facebook and Instagram and all the other social media networks, and you have the ability to control what data they keep on you to some degree. You have the ability to obviously delete your account. You have the ability to stop sharing contacts, all that stuff. But that's a first party relationship. Apple's not a party to that. You have that relationship with Facebook. You have a Facebook account. Apple is not enforcing your privacy on Facebook, except in that instance, because think about Facebook as an example. I can access Facebook from my laptop. That has nothing to do with my relationship with Apple. So I agree with you in one sense on Apple having quote unquote control, but in reality, like this is still a first party relationship, and Apple, for a big part of that first party relationship, is giving you the decision on whether to serve up your contacts or not. But in terms of how that data is used once Facebook and Instagram have that to me reverts back to a first party decision between you and Facebook or you and Instagram, and then any other downstream applications of that. And I think the second part of this from a privacy standpoint, where there's an effect on folks, and this is focused more on founders. To your point, we talk about lookalike audiences and things like that. I think the downstream effects of not having the most current data means that as a founder, you're playing catch up in terms of being able to draw the full picture of a customer, whether it's who they're connected to or what their likes or interests are. And I think Ask App Not to Track focused on the likes and interests. This change focuses more on who you're connected to. And I think probably the biggest thing I would say here is, do you remember, God, I'm not going to remember the name of it, the audio app that came out during COVID?
I remember what
Clubhouse.
you're talking about. Clubhouse, yeah.
Clubhouse.
God, are they still around?
Who knows? Clubhouse grew because I could tag all my friends real quickly, and help them grow their network, and I would invite people into my Clubhouse chats who were not part of Clubhouse already. That sort of viral growth will be likely significantly stunted under this change with Apple.
Yep. I think it's gonna be interesting to watch, man, for sure. And I don't disagree with you, by the way. I think, but this is all the stuff they're gonna have to iron out and make sure, like it's you and I are not gonna be affected by this directly, I don't think. But at the same time, I don't know. It feels like such a subtle change, but it's probably going to affect our ad spend and like our ability to target some more and things like that. It's gonna be a wild one. They didn't say when it was coming out, though, did they?
This is out actually to some degree. It's being rolled out in the most recent in the Apple.
So probably 18.1, which is at the end of this month, I think. So, all right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see.
Moment.
No, definitely not a dull moment. This is like I think it'll be interesting to see how this rolls out over the next handful of months. I mean, it's easy to say that we don't think there's going to be another big social media app coming anytime soon, but then you look at the realities of all the people that don't spend any time on Facebook and are spending time elsewhere, where those folks might migrate to.
Yeah.
As a quick update, talked about it real briefly at the top of the show. New York Times is now suing another generative AI company. In this case, they're suing Perplexity, which is, I believe, is Amazon backed, if I remember correctly. Or, sorry, Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, it's not clear if it's a business or him, but yeah.
Yeah, and so same as what's happened in the past, New York Times is saying, hey, your model is trained pretty heavily on our content, and whether they did that by buying a license and scraping information and putting it in their database, or they got that information from a third party, folks quoting New York Times articles and other places, that information seems to be prevalent enough in the Perplexity model that the New York Times felt like they needed to sue. I think this really emphasizes something you and I have talked about a bunch on the show, which is there just really isn't clear definition on how to protect your content in this world.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how discovery happens. I mean, look, these lawsuits are going to get mired down in a long process while people try to figure it out. But I mean, I've never been on this kind of a lawsuit, but you and I both know that in quote unquote regular lawsuits, there's if you don't settle quickly, there's probably going to be some amount of discovery, and the name of the game is just overwhelm the other side with just a bunch of stuff. Even if it's printout of emails, and 99% of them are not even relevant, right? So it's like, okay, it's already hard enough when you're trying to figure out, like, what is that one email in those 100,000 they provided you that is the smoking gun for whatever it is, the lawsuit.
Yeah.
What are they going to do when it's an LLM? And what are you going to do? Like print 3 billion pages of code or something? I mean, I don't even know what that looks like, Yeah. So I think I'm not trying to make fun of the situation. I just think that, even on Twitter lately, there's been a bunch of indie hackers that I follow that are kind of showing screenshots of, known AI scrapers that are willfully ignoring the robots.txt file that you're supposed to put out there and that crawlers are supposed to follow. So until there's actually like enforcement of this, I think you're going to see more and more of this unethical web scraping. And until somebody with deep enough pockets, maybe it's these guys, maybe it's New York Times, who knows? But until somebody with deep enough pockets, forces this issue into the courts, I don't know. I think we're all kind of like going to be passengers on this to see where it lands. But I just chuckle because I just can't imagine what the discovery looks like eventually when it's like, okay, show me that your LLM, prove to me that your LLM does not have my data that was blocked or whatever. Show me that it was not trained on. And what in the world is that going to look like? It's like, I imagine it's going to be a dump truck of paper.
Yeah, it's going to be messy, 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 messy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a real problem though, right? It's like, I get it. Like if you're New York Times and the systems can summarize what's behind the paywall, there's real damage there. And you've said this before as we talk about lawsuits, is that, a big part of the lawsuit is you have to be able to prove that damage occurred.
Yeah.
And this is direct, like, in other words, if somebody were to scrape Strata's public data, it'd be very hard, I think, to then draw a direct line to damages because we published it and it's not like what we monetize on. We would not be able to be a party to that lawsuit, I don't think. But here, New York Times is like, hey, we make our money off of a paywall and you somehow scraped and then used our data behind, whatever. So that's going to be where it's really interesting because the number of players that are affected that can also be parties to this kind of a lawsuit, that just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So it'll be interesting to see where this one plays out. But I think this is just worth people keeping an eye on because, for anybody listening to this who has like maybe a significant portion or maybe a double-digit percentage of their web traffic coming via SEO, it's just a matter of time where if this sort of stuff doesn't get figured out for the big guys, then you're going to get affected too.
Yeah. Well, and it's happening in a pretty real way for smaller content creators that I know in the space for sure. Right.
So,
all right, so let's finish up talking about Google. There was an initial judgment back in it was early in the year where a jury found that Google had violated antitrust law, and this was different than the Apple suit, where Apple largely, quote unquote, won against against Epic Games, the makers of Fortnite. In this case, Google quote unquote lost, and the judge has now come out with restrictions. And so let's start at the high level here. Starting on November 1st and for the next 3 years, the company must allow developers to bring their own app stores to the Android mobile operating system. It must also allow app makers to charge users with their own billing systems outside of the Android ecosystem. Importantly, Google will be entitled to charge developers, quote unquote, a reasonable fee for these services, which must be based on Google's actual costs. Mr. Singh, what say you?
I mean, are we surprised? I think the most surprising part is that at face value, it seems like Apple got a different outcome than Google. So
for sure,
I'm not a law student, so I don't know how to read between the lines here and figure out what the subtle argument difference was that
right.
that caused this. But I got to imagine that Apple at some point is like, ooh, this might be a precedent. Like they probably can't have the same person open the lawsuit again, but the next time that lawsuit gets filed, I think everybody's going to point to this. I don't know. This will be really interesting to see how it plays out, because like on the one hand, I can get it as a business, you're Google, you put the app store together, that's your walled garden and you should bear the fruit of that garden.
Right.
On the other hand, you and Apple got so big that now you're kind of blocking everybody else out. And unless somebody else were to create their own walled garden and somehow build a phone that billions of people want to carry, it's very difficult to get in. So I don't know. This maybe gets into the uncomfortable topic of like, where does capitalism kind of where are the boundaries, and maybe that's like beyond the scope of this show. But I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I mean, I think, and I'll just say this in the context of Strata, for example, like, as we think about, look, so I wear an Apple Watch. I don't have anything Android, but I'll just use this as an example of like how I think about this might affect us. Is that like, right now my Apple Watch, the other day, I'm training for a marathon and the Apple Watch, said like, hey, your gait, like the way that, I guess I don't know what you call that medically, but your gait, like your stride and the way you walk and the side you favor, it's like your gait has changed by 0.7%, and you should reach out for the care of a licensed physical therapist. It didn't tell me that something's wrong. It's like, hey, something's changed with this. You should probably go see somebody. And sure enough, it sort of coincided with the fact that like I was feeling a little achy in my left side. But here's the thing, in order for me as a consumer to connect that to my doctor so that doctor could reach out to me, very trivial thing. It's not a very trivial thing at all, because you either have to have, as a healthcare system need to be large enough to have integrated with Apple's Health Kit, or as I understand it, you need to like your EMR or the software you use to manage your practice needs to be a mobile app that can directly link to the phone. So anyway, the point is that like there are certain things that businesses cannot access on the device unless they are apps. And, prior to something like this, you really have to think about, okay, what's our Android app and what's our Apple app? Because that's how we're going to get the on-device information. But hey, depending on how this gets rolled out, maybe we only need the Apple app and there's a way to port it. I don't know. I'm talking above my pay grade here, but the point is though, is that like, access into that walled garden, maybe it'll be good for all of us. I don't know. I'm again, this is way above my pay grade. I don't know where this goes, but maybe this is also like the Apple, the counterpoint to this is maybe this is also kind of like the Apple judgment in the EU, where like Apple had to like give European developers the ability to create their own app stores, but they put significantly high barriers in there so that very few players could enter. And so I think the average European has not gotten a better experience, but yet Apple's in compliance. So maybe that's what's going to happen here too. Who knows?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. First off, and I want to get to that point, I'll just touch real briefly on one other thing real quick. I think the comments from the judge that the fees need to be based on Google's actual costs, I think I could drive a truck through that in terms of enforceability, in terms of building my fees in a way that it's just like, these are reasonable fees for us. So I do think that Google has some wiggle room in what they're going to be able to charge people here, which will likely stifle the innovation of a host of competing app stores. Like companies like Epic and Fortnite, like they can, Epic's big enough that they can figure this out. Smaller companies, I think, will be a lot tougher. I think the other thing too, and I'll read a bit from the article, which I think is interesting, And this talks, I think, a little bit more to what you mentioned about, just how prevalent this will be. So let me read this quote from the article. Find here. Google can no longer use incentives to stop app makers from telling users they can buy subscriptions outside Google's billing system. It can also no longer force phone makers to pre-install the Google Play Store in any specific location on a device's screen or prevent them from loading other app stores with those conditions. And so what I do find interesting here, though, is that when you read through this language, essentially what this means is that Google probably now has to pay to play on their own systems, i.e. if they want the most prominent placement for an app store, they're going to need to pay to be on the home screen of any one of these different Android devices. But in doing so, in call it unlocking the gate to the walled garden, they've also, I think the judges also put this in a position where, again, the Googles and the Epics of the world have enough money to fight for position on the front screen. You and I don't. And so if there are going to be additional stores, it's going to be likely very big players because there's a lot of money to be made there. And then the only way I see penetration for smaller companies to get better deals is if one of those stores, we'll use Epic as the example right now because they were the plaintiff here in this lawsuit. If Epic decides they're going to have a business model where they're like, let's play small ball. Let's make it really cheap for people to put apps on there because we want 1 million apps to make sure we can find the next unicorn app. That could be a way that companies can make more money off these app stores. But I think largely from a founder's perspective, you really have to wait to see how this ecosystem sifts out, because right now I think Google's going to have a long runway here to have a pretty big wall around the garden.
Yep. Well, this is going to sound, I'll just admit my little bias here, by the way. I'll just say that, I think it gets harder and harder by the quarter to justify being an entrepreneur in the consumer space. between Apple making it harder to get to the contact list, these app store restrictions that sort of like, it's just, that's not to say that there's not opportunity there for sure, right? Man, maybe I'm getting old, maybe I'm getting lazy, I don't know, but the more and more all these rules change and all these like big platforms fight each other out to do this, the more it's kind of like, B2B is kind of where it's easier to be. Maybe that's the quote. B2B is where it's easier to be, right? Because it's so simple. It's like, you either provide enough value to justify some business paying you or you don't. It's the market decides whether or not you're good or bad. And here in the consumer space, it's not enough to make something that people want, because you also kind of have to do it within the confines and the frameworks of these platforms. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's just me admitting that I'm too lazy to work that hard. I don't know, but more power to consumer-focused entrepreneurs.
Yeah, well, yeah, for sure. Definitely not something I'm running out to go start a bunch of B2C businesses. Well,
yeah, right.
I think that's a good place to pin it for this week.
I love it, man. All right, so do you even get to go home before I see you in Sioux Falls?
I do. I'm home I haven't booked my flight home yet from this trip because I'm not sure what time I get to leave New York on Friday. But I'm either going to be home at 7 a.m. or 10 a.m. Saturday morning, and then I have a Sunday midday flight to Minnesota, and then I get to come home for like 48 hours before we go to Sioux Falls. So I get a whopping almost 3 days, not consecutively, before I see you. And I can't wait to spend time with you in South Dakota, said nobody ever.
Yeah. Well, if anybody listening to this is going to be in Sioux Falls, what is that, October 24th and 25th, there will be 2 Virginians and a New Yorker wandering around the AI conference and dinner tables with a couple smart people and talking all things about email marketing and monetization and all the unsexy stuff that only we care about.
And yeah, I would agree with exactly that. All the unsexy stuff that you and I care about. I would say though, I would take one small issue with how you described us. Well, I do live in Virginia. Despite what anybody else says, I absolutely consider myself a New Yorker.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll have to report you to the local IRS. Then you better be paying taxes up there.
There you go. Go Yankees. All right, man. Have a great rest of the day.
All right. Safe travels, dude. See ya.